In January 1954, a Soviet intelligence officer walked out of his life in Tokyo and into the unknown. His name was Yurii Rastvorov, and on paper he was a diplomatic translator at the Soviet embassy in Japan. In reality, he was a state security officer, a man trained in the dark arts of recruitment, surveillance, and espionage. He had spent years building networks from Moscow in Asia. He knew where the Soviet Union's eyes and ears were, who they talked to, and what they were looking for. When he chose to defect, he didn't bring a suitcase full of microfilm. He brought something more dangerous for the Soviet system, a map of how it actually worked in an entire theater of the Cold War. To understand what his choice meant, you have to begin with where he came from. Yurii Rastvorov was born in 1921, part of the generation that grew up entirely inside the Soviet experiment. He entered adulthood in a country forged by revolution, civil war, and Stalin's terror. By the time he reached his early 20s, World War II was raging. Like many capable young men, he was drawn into the expanding world of Soviet intelligence. Between 1944 and 1946, he received state security training in Moscow. These were not casual language courses or administrative seminars. They were the training ground for people who would serve in the MGB and later MVD, the successors to the NKVD, the organizations that combined secret police, internal security, and foreign intelligence under one roof. When the war ended, Stalin's gaze turned outward. Europe was divided. Asia was in flux. Japan had surrendered but was now under American occupation. For Moscow, that made Japan a crucial target. It sat at the edge of the Soviet Far East, close to the strategic choke points of the Pacific, and had become a base for U.S. military power. If the Soviet Union wanted to understand and, if possible, undermine American strategy in Asia, it needed people on the ground in Tokyo. That is where Yurii Rastvorov was sent. He arrived in Japan under diplomatic cover. Officially, he was a translator or press officer at the Soviet embassy. Unofficially, he was a Soviet state security officer operating under the Foreign Ministry's umbrella. The embassy gave him immunity, access, and a platform. But his real office was not behind a desk. It was out in the city, in the clubs, restaurants, tennis courts, and quiet back rooms where information actually moved. One of his key hunting grounds was the Tokyo Lawn Tennis Club. To an outsider, it was just a social venue, an elite space where diplomats, businessmen, and senior Japanese officials played matches, drank together, and traded gossip off the record. To a trained intelligence officer, it was a gold mine. People are most honest when they are relaxed. In a place like that, an artfully curious translator could learn much more than he ever would at a formal negotiating table. Who was rising and who was falling in a ministry? Who was angry at American pressure? Who was sympathetic to socialist ideas? Who drank too much and talked too freely? Rastvorov's task, and the task of the four-man Soviet team he helped lead in Tokyo, was to identify and develop sources in that environment. Some targets were Japanese officials, mid-level bureaucrats who saw no harm in sharing unimportant internal information over drinks. Others were business figures with connections to the United States or to strategic sectors. Occasionally, they looked at military personnel. At one point, they probed whether an American airman might be willing to sell details of U.S. jet aircraft. The U.S. Air Force officially denied that any such sale occurred, but the fact that the Soviets were trying tells you what they were after. Not just political mood music, but hard information on American technology and capabilities in the Pacific. When you put yourself in the shoes of a Soviet officer like Rastvorov in that period, you begin to see the contrast that shaped his later choice. He had been trained in Moscow, in institutions where secrecy, fear, and loyalty to the party were drilled into every student. He arrived in Japan to find a society rebuilding under American occupation, with newspapers, new political parties, and a growing consumer culture. He watched American officers move around Japan with a confidence that came from knowing their country was economically and technologically ascendant. He saw U.S. bases with new aircraft, radios, and logistics systems. He saw Japanese businesses beginning to adopt Western practices and machinery. Every report he wrote back to Moscow had to describe not only the vulnerabilities the Soviet Union might exploit, but also the growing strengths of its main rival. All of this intelligence was fed into a vast reporting chain. Rastvorov and his colleagues would meet sources, listen, ask questions, and then retreat to safe locations to write their notes. Those notes would be encoded, sent back to Moscow, and digested by analysts who built profiles of Japanese ministries, American posture in Asia, and the political currents of the Pacific. To the Soviet leadership, this information was essential. They believed, correctly, that the United States was using Japan as a base for power projection. They believed, again correctly, that American technology, from jets to radar to communications, was ahead of theirs, and they believed they could mitigate that gap through targeted espionage. So long as Stalin lived, the basic rules of the Soviet system were clear. You did what you were told. You did not question the party. You did not imagine a life outside the system. The price of doubt was prison or death. But in March 1953, Stalin died. His inner circle scrambled for power. Within months, Lavrenti Beria, the feared chief of the security apparatus and the man who had overseen so many purges, was himself arrested and by December executed. For officers abroad, this sent a shock wave. If the man who had personified state security could be dragged from power and shot, what did that say about the stability of the system? If being loyal to Beria one day could become a death sentence the next, what did that mean for those who had advanced under his protection? Back in Moscow, the new leadership began reorganizing the security services. Reorganization in the Soviet context was a polite word that often disguised purges. People disappeared, files were opened, past associations were reevaluated. From Tokyo, the recall orders began to come. Officers were told to report back to Moscow for consultations and security checks. For a Soviet intelligence officer overseas, such a summons could mean a routine debriefing. It could also mean arrest at the airport, interrogation in Lubyanka, and a one-way trip to a prison camp or an execution cellar. There was no way to know which it would be until it was too late. In early 1954, Yurii Rastvorov received his recall. He was to leave Tokyo and return to the Soviet Union. On paper, this was a normal rotation. In reality, in the wake of Beria's fall, it looked like a trap. He knew colleagues who had gone back and vanished. He knew that his own background, a grandfather denounced as a kulak, ties to people now under suspicion, might count against him. He also knew, perhaps more clearly now than ever, that the system he served was not just ruthless against its enemies, it was ruthless against its own. On January 24, 1954, he made his choice. Instead of boarding a plane home, he disappeared from his post. In Tokyo, this created an immediate crisis for the Soviet embassy. A state security officer had gone missing. They notified Japanese authorities. Behind the scenes, they scrambled to find him, knowing that if he reached American hands, he could expose their entire network. But the city where he had once hunted sources was now a city in which he was the hunted. Rastvorov did not walk into the nearest U.S. facility in a moment of spontaneous panic. Defection at that level usually involves careful thought, even if it is compressed into a few days. He would have considered what he knew, what he could offer, and what risks he would be taking. He would have known that if he failed, capture by his own people meant death. Capture by the Japanese, still host to U.S. forces, would likely mean handover to the Americans anyway, but without control of the narrative. In the end, he managed to make contact with American intelligence. The CIA, alerted to the opportunity, moved quickly. Secretly, they spirited him out of Japan, reportedly taking him first to Okinawa, at that time a major American military and intelligence hub in the region. There, far from the clubs of Tokyo and the corridors of the Soviet embassy, Yurii Rastvorov began to talk. For American listeners, these were the moments that justified the enormous investment in counterintelligence. Here was a man who could describe from the inside how the Soviet Union ran its human operations in one of the most strategically vital theaters on Earth. He would have been asked to reconstruct the structure of the network, who reported to whom in Tokyo, what other Soviet officers were doing under diplomatic or commercial cover, how messages were passed, which Japanese ministries they had penetrated, what kinds of information Moscow valued most. He likely described in detail his operations at places like the Tokyo Lawn Tennis Club, explaining how seemingly innocent social venues were turned into recruitment grounds. He could list names of Soviet colleagues, of Japanese intermediaries, of potential or actual sources. He also offered something more strategic, insight into how Moscow perceived U.S. power in Asia. In one declassified chronology from the U.S. defense establishment, there is a note that he briefed President Dwight Eisenhower personally in 1954, and during that briefing raised the possibility that some American and United Nations prisoners of war from the Korean War had been transported to Siberia. That allegation tapped directly into American fears that not all POWs had been returned, and that the Soviet Union might be using them as intelligence assets or test subjects in the far reaches of its camp system. In August 1954, the United States government took the unusual step of making his defection public in a very visible way. The State Department organized a press conference in Washington, D.C. There, before American and international reporters, Yurii Rastvorov appeared in person. He read a prepared statement. He said that for a long time he had wanted to live like a decent human being, but could never say so in the Soviet Union, not even in front of friends or family, because any expression of doubt could lead to denunciation. It was a simple sentence, but it cut to the heart of the matter. A system that required its servants to hide their basic human desires from their own relatives was not a system built for human beings. The diplomatic theater that followed was telling. The State Department offered the Soviet ambassador, Georgy Zarubin, an immediate opportunity to meet with the defector, or at least to discuss the case with Undersecretary Walter Bedell Smith, a former general who had served as Eisenhower's wartime chief of staff and the first director of the CIA. The Soviet embassy refused. They declined to meet Smith. They declined to see Rastvorov. They refused to even dignify the possibility that one of their officers might have defected of his own free will. Publicly, Moscow accused the United States of kidnapping him. Privately, the Supreme Court of the USSR later sentenced him to death in absentia. From that point on, for the Soviet system, he was a non-person, a traitor whose name could only be whispered. For the United States and its allies, he was a living archive. Western scholars of intelligence later noted that his defection, and those of a handful of others in the same period, effectively wrecked the Soviet apparatus in Japan. Networks had to be shut down or rebuilt. Potential agents in Japanese ministries worried that their names might now be in CIA files. Soviet officers who had worked with him knew they would be under particular suspicion. Moscow tightened its personnel vetting and rotated others out of sensitive posts in the Far East. Yurii Rastvorov's decision did more than just expose a slice of Soviet intelligence operations. It highlighted something fundamental about the East-West contest. The Soviet Union had tried to project power into Asia using the tools it knew best: clandestine networks, ideological cultivation, and exploitation of personal relationships. The United States, by contrast, was projecting power through bases, alliances, and technology. In Japan and across the Pacific, American jets, carriers, logistics systems, and the beginnings of advanced communications were visible on the ground and in the air. A Soviet officer like Rastvorov could not help but see the disparity. Every time he tried to recruit a Japanese official by playing on resentment of American presence, he had to confront the fact that American money, machines, and know-how were helping rebuild Japan's economy. Every time he gathered details on U.S. aircraft or radar systems, he had to report upward that those systems were serious, modern, and ahead of what Soviet systems could field in the region. The very intelligence he was collecting for the Kremlin was a constant reminder of the Soviet system's technological lag. His choice to defect in Tokyo, rather than waiting to go home, was in part a reaction to internal Soviet politics, the terror of another purge, the fear of being caught in a post-Beria cleanup. But it was also a reaction to years of living in a place where he could see, with his own eyes, the difference between two worlds. In one world, information and initiative flowed downward from a small group in Moscow, through rigid channels, into networks that had to be constantly watched for disloyalty. In the other, information and initiative bubbled up through companies, universities, and military commands that were constantly iterating and adapting. In one world, fear was the main tool of control. In the other, even with all its flaws and injustices, people walked a little taller because they believed they had some say in their own lives. When Americans look back on early Cold War defectors like Yurii Rastvorov, there is, understandably, a fascination with the spycraft, the clandestine meetings, the embassy intrigues, the sudden disappearances. But the deeper story is about recognition. Recognition on the part of Soviet insiders that their system was brittle. Recognition on the part of Western leaders that human intelligence could reveal not only secrets, but also the mindset of their adversary. And recognition among ordinary citizens who read about these cases in newspapers that the freedoms they sometimes took for granted were powerful enough to pull people across oceans and out of the heart of the enemy's own apparatus. The Cold War in Asia was not decided in a single battle or treaty. It was an accumulation of choices, policies, and perceptions. The defection of one Soviet officer from Tokyo did not, by itself, change the balance, but it contributed to a broader pattern: Soviet networks in key regions being compromised by their own people's doubts. American and Allied services building a more accurate picture of what they were up against, and the steady realization on both sides that the United States' combination of military strength, technological innovation, and open society posed a challenge the Soviet model could not easily solve. In later years, Rastvorov would live quietly in the West, his name resurfacing occasionally in press accounts or memoirs. His death sentence in the Soviet Union remained on the books long after his former colleagues had retired or died. The apparatus he had served continued to operate under new names and new leaders for decades, but the logic that had driven him to break away continued to eat at that apparatus from within. As technology advanced, as computers shrank and networks grew, as information began to move faster and farther than any sensors could control, the space for a closed, fear-based system shrank. That, ultimately, is the emotional core of his story for an American audience. It is not just that our side gained a spy. It is that a man trained to see the world through the eyes of a hostile state looked at the realities of American power in Asia, at the planes on the runway, the radios on the ships, the factories in Japan rebuilding under American influence, and concluded that the future lay with openness, not secrecy, with innovation, not stagnation. His defection in Tokyo was a signal, long before the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the Soviet project was cracking where it could least afford to crack, in the minds of its own elite. In that sense, the story of Yurii Rastvorov is not just a Cold War anecdote. It is a case study in how great power competition really works. Tanks and missiles matter, but so do the perceptions of the people inside the systems that build and aim them. When those people begin to choose the other side, not because of bribes or momentary fear, but because they have seen which model is more likely to deliver a decent life, the outcome of the competition begins to tilt. His path from Moscow training schools to Tokyo tennis courts to a Washington press conference traces that tilt, one human life at a time.